This is a medieval world map. If you look closely, you can see how cramped and localized the European understanding of the globe really was in the 13th century. Beyond the immediate borders of the continent, the map is driven by myth rather than geography. People believed the Far East was populated by human-dog hybrids, by fire-breathing dragons and unicorns, rather than actual functioning societies. Driven by a fearful, fragmented view of the outside world, European merchants kept their ambitions incredibly small. Almost all long-distance trade was strictly confined to the familiar coasts of the Mediterranean basin. In 1271, a 17-year-old named Marco Polo left his home in Venice. He set out with his father Niccolo and his uncle Maffeo, a pair of veteran merchants. They were not aiming to map the unknown or document foreign cultures. They were chasing profit. This metal medallion with vertical inscriptions is a paisa. It served as a golden passport granted directly by the Mongol leader, Kublai Khan. For the Polos, this object was their sole source of protection for a 10,000-mile journey, guaranteeing them safe passage under the threat of the Khan's entire army. Stepping past the safe boundaries of the known map required walking into environments humans were barely equipped to handle. Earning a profit meant surviving a lethal test of endurance. Looking at this high-altitude valley in the Pamir Mountains, you get a sense of the brutal conditions they faced. The elevation was so extreme and the oxygen so thin that the caravan struggled to even keep their campfires burning. The sheer physical stress of the ascent broke Marco's health. He contracted a severe respiratory illness, heavily speculated by historians to be tuberculosis. The condition was severe enough that the entire expedition had to halt in modern-day Afghanistan for a full year while he recovered. Once over the mountains, the environment immediately inverted. They descended into the Gobi Desert. Here, they faced lethal temperature swings, enduring blazing heat of 40 degrees Celsius during the day, only to drop below freezing at night. The psychological strain was just as intense. As the wind whipped over the massive dunes, it created a low hum, a phenomenon known as singing sands. Exhausted travelers often hallucinated, mistaking acoustic frequencies for vengeful spirits calling their names. Enduring years of absolute physical and psychological extremity was simply the required toll to reach the threshold of the Mongol court. Marco survived the barren Silk Road to arrive at this, Xanadu, Kublai Khan's summer palace. It was a massive, multi-tiered complex surrounded by lush gardens. Engineers had even installed advanced climate control, running heated pipes under polished hardwood floors to keep the royal court warm in the winter. Marco quickly proved his worth to the Khan. He mastered several ancient languages, including Mongolian, allowing him to transition from a curious foreign guest to a functioning member of the imperial administration. Over the next 17 years, he carried out specific, high-level duties. He traveled the provinces as a regional intelligence gatherer to keep the Khan informed, and he managed the logistics of the highly lucrative imperial salt trade. Operating as a trusted insider gave him unparalleled access. He was able to directly observe the daily mechanics of the largest contiguous empire on Earth. What Marco documented completely contradicted the European assumption of superiority. First, he encountered a functional, empire-wide paper currency. Rather than hauling heavy chests of gold and silver across the continent, merchants used lightweight notes. This is a Yuan Dynasty metal printing block, shown next to a printed specimen of that early paper money. This was fiat currency, money that has value purely because the government says it does. The state produced and stamped every note with intricate designs to strictly control the supply and prevent counterfeiting. The second shock was their primary energy source. Marco noted that citizens were digging up and burning black stones for heat and light. He was looking at widespread domestic and industrial coal usage, centuries before European nations would adopt the practice. Then there was the infrastructure. To maintain control over such a vast territory, the Khan operated a postal relay system known as the Yam. It was a staggering network connecting 10,000 fully equipped post stations across the empire. Because fresh horses were kept ready and waiting at every single stop, an imperial messenger could cover up to 250 miles in a single day. These were not isolated novelties. Paper money, coal energy, and rapid continent-wide communication proved the existence of a unified superpower. They were operating with a level of civic engineering completely unfathomable to the divided, warring states back in Europe. In 1295, after 24 years away, the Polos survived a harrowing sea journey and finally returned to Venice. When they arrived at their own home, wearing Mongolian clothing and speaking heavily accented Italian, their family turned them away, believing they were total strangers. Marco's homecoming was brief. 3 years later, while captaining a ship in a naval conflict against the rival Republic of Genoa, he was captured and thrown into a medieval prison. This illuminated manuscript page is a surviving copy of the Travels of Marco Polo. While imprisoned, Marco shared his cell with an author named Rustichello de Pisa. To pass the time, Marco recounted his memories, and Rustichello compiled them into a published manuscript. When the book began circulating across Europe, the public largely rejected it. To a society strictly bound to the Mediterranean, factual accounts of paper money, black stones that burned, and a continent-spanning postal service sounded like pure fiction. The skepticism followed him for the rest of his life. In 1324, as Marco lay on his deathbed, friends urged him to confess his lies and cleanse his soul. He outright refused them, stating plainly that he had not written down even half of what he had truly witnessed. But the manuscript survived the skeptics. Decades later, a heavily annotated copy of Polo's Scravelogue fell into the hands of an ambitious navigator looking for a western sea route to the wealth described in those pages, Christopher Columbus. By surviving extreme physical hardship and meticulously recording the facts of the Mongol administration, one Venetian merchant broke the mental boundaries of medieval geography. His Ledger of the East served as the direct catalyst for the global age of discovery.
My name is Marco Polo, and I'm not speaking to you from some grand Venetian palace or the glittering court of a great Khan, no. I'm in a Genoese prison. Damp stone, that's my home now. And it's here, of all places, that I've been convinced to finally tell my story. My cellmate, a writer named Rustichello, he says it must be written down. He says it's a story so vast, so full of wonders, that most people, well, they just can't wrap their minds around it.
You know, back home in Venice, kids follow me in the streets. They shout, "Hey, Mr. Marco, tell us another one of your lies." They think my stories of the East are just fairy tales. But I'm here to tell you, what I saw, it was real. And the truth? Oh, the truth is so much stranger, so much more incredible than any lie I could ever dream up.
It's funny, isn't it? If the Genoese hadn't captured me, if I hadn't been thrown into this exact cell with this man, Rustichello, my whole story would have just vanished, died with me. But he writes romances, you see, grand adventures, and he heard my tales and saw something real in them, something others just called lies. It's his pen, right now, that's making sure my memories escape these prison walls.
Okay, so, before we go any further, you have to understand the world I stepped into. See, a journey like mine, it would have been suicide just a little while before. The world was just too broken up, too dangerous. So, what changed? Well, the Mongols. That's what. The descendants of Genghis Khan, they conquered so much territory that they created this incredible thing. They called it the Pax Mongolia, the Mongolian peace. Suddenly, the whole continent was sort of unified, and that meant the Silk Road, that great highway of trade, was safe. It was like a door had been opened, a path all the way from Europe to the East. That's the only reason we could even think of making the trip.
And just look at this, it really shows you what I'm talking about. My home, Venice, we thought we were the center of the world, right? A powerhouse. But look at it compared to the Mongol Empire. It's just a speck. It's just tiny. We weren't talking about another kingdom here. This was an empire so massive, so unbelievably huge, it could swallow all of Europe whole and you'd barely even notice.
I was just 17 when we left. Me, my father, and my uncle. And for 3.5 years, we just traveled. I mean, could you imagine? We climbed the Pamir Mountains, what they called the roof of the world. The air up there is so thin you can't even get a decent fire going. Then came the Gobi Desert, miles and miles of nothing. And the wind makes this sound in the dunes, like it's singing to you. It's a sound that can make you think you're going crazy. It wasn't a trip. It was a test of survival every single day. And then, we finally made it. We arrived. And in that moment, everything I'd ever been taught, everything I believed about the world, it just fell apart. We Venetians, we were so proud. We thought we were the most advanced people on Earth. We were so wrong. The world of Kublai Khan, it was so sophisticated, so full of incredible inventions, Europe couldn't even begin to imagine it.
You know, being a merchant, the first thing that just blew my mind was the money. We were used to hauling these heavy bags of gold and silver, right? Always looking over your shoulder for thieves. But there, they used paper. Just paper. Little notes made from mulberry bark. And everyone accepted them. It was so simple, so light, so safe. It was brilliant. An entire empire's economy running on something that back home I would have just used to light a campfire. And it just kept coming. The wonders didn't stop. They didn't burn wood for heat. They burned these black stones, what we now call coal, that burned hotter and way longer. Their cities weren't like ours, all twisted alleys and confusing streets. Nope, they were laid out on perfect, logical grids. And their postal system, I mean, come on. They had 10,000 post houses set up. A messenger could cover 250 miles in a single day. Think about that. It was just unbelievable.
Look, let's just break it down side by side. It makes it really clear just how different things were. In Europe, heavy gold and silver coins. In China, paper notes. Our energy source was wood. Theirs was coal. We used private messengers whenever you could find one. They had a massive organized postal system. And our cities grew like weeds, all tangled up. Theirs were planned on a grid. You see, this wasn't just a few little differences. It was a completely different level of civilization. The gap between our worlds was just staggering.
And the great Khan himself, Kublai, he was a sharp man, very curious. He saw how fascinated I was by everything, and he noticed I had a knack for languages. So he took me into his service. He made me his envoy. And for 17 years, think about that, 17 years, I wasn't just a Venetian merchant anymore. I was his man. I traveled all over his empire, from one end to the other, doing his bidding.
But you know what really, truly got to me? The tolerance. I saw Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, all living together under the Khan's rule. His way of thinking was, well, it was practical. And honestly, it was pretty enlightened. His attitude was basically, look, as long as you're loyal and you pay your taxes, what you believe about God is your own business. Coming from Europe, which was constantly tearing itself apart over religion, that was a powerful thing to see.
And the more I traveled for him, the stranger the world got. I mean, truly strange. I saw pearl merchants in Tabriz making deals without saying a word, just by squeezing each other's hands under a blanket. In Hami, men would offer their own wives to guests as a sign of respect. Can you believe it? Or in Tibet, where a father hoped his daughter had many lovers before she got married. And maybe the strangest of all, in Yunnan, when a woman had a baby, she'd get up and go back to work, and the husband would go to bed for 40 days to recover. It was a world turned upside down.
Yeah, stories like that, that's how I got my reputation. Il Milione, the man of a million lies. They're just so different from anything a European has ever experienced that, well, they have to be made up, right? But I have to be honest here, with you and with myself. Did I tell Rustichello the complete, absolute truth every single time?
The answer is no. Look, I was young, I was ambitious, and I wanted to make an impression. So I told a story about how my family, the Polos, brought these amazing European siege engines that finally won the Great Siege of Shangyang for the Khan. The real story? The siege was already over by the time we even got to China. The Mongols didn't need our help. They had incredible engineers of their own. It was a bit of a stretch, a boast, to make us seem more valuable. A little bit of a storyteller's touch, you might say.
24 years. Just think about that number. 24 years. I was gone for an entire lifetime. When we finally made it back to our family's house in Venice, we looked completely different. We had long beards, we were dressed in foreign clothes, our own family didn't even know who we were. They thought we had died years ago. Our way home finally came with one last job from the Khan. We were to escort a Mongol princess, Kokochin, on a long sea voyage to Persia, where she was to be married. It was a dangerous trip, but it was our only ticket home. And when we finally stepped onto the docks in Venice again, we were strangers. Strangers in our own home city. We came back with pockets full of jewels, sure, but we were far richer in the stories we had to tell.
So what happened to the stories I'm telling Rustichello right now in this very cell? Well, his book, it took off. It spread all over Europe.
For the first time, mapmakers actually had a real description of what the Far East looked like. And they say that hundreds of years from now, another Italian, a man named Columbus, is going to read my book. He'll get obsessed with finding a new way to get to the riches I described, the golden roofs of Japan, and in looking for my world, he'll end up finding a new one altogether.
Even on my deathbed, they say a priest came to me begging me to take it all back, to confess my lies before I met my maker. And you know what I told him? I told him what I'm telling you. I have not told half of what I saw. The truth, the real truth, was even bigger, even stranger, even more magnificent than the stories I told.
And that's the question I'll leave you with. Think about it. If the stories I did tell about paper money and burning stones and postal systems that could cross a continent were already too much for people to believe, then what about the things I didn't tell? What marvels did I see that were so unbelievable, so far beyond comprehension, that I decided to keep them to myself, right here in this prison cell?
Marco Polo's 24-year journey through Asia is rarely treated as serious history. It is usually categorized alongside myths and children's fables, framed as a simple medieval adventure. But treating the text this way ignores its actual utility. The Travels of Marco Polo is a complex hybrid historical dataset, an intelligence report on the world's largest empire. This illuminated manuscript page shows how European readers received the story. The layout exposes a stark contradiction. The bottom half contains rigid blocks of Gothic text, the hard administrative data of Kublai Khan's state. Surrounding it are elaborate romanticized illustrations of Venetian architecture and medieval fantasies. This physical layout mirrors the historiographical problem of the book. Polo recorded highly accurate empirical intelligence on imperial administration and trade routes, but those facts are tightly wrapped in fabricated romance, local myth, and exaggerated self-importance. To extract the true mechanics of the Mongol Empire from this account, we must systematically separate Polo's empirical data from literary invention. Treating the text purely as fact or fiction fails. Its actual value only emerges through rigorous source deconstruction. In the 1270s, Polo's native Venice was a powerful commercial center built on maritime financial capitalism. It was a system heavily dependent on merchant middlemen, loading and moving physical goods from Alexandria and the Levant into Europe. This trade faced severe physical limitations. Every major transaction required the transportation of heavy, volatile bullion, gold and silver. Expanding economic reach meant carrying the physical weight to match it. When Marco, his father, and his uncle arrived at the court of the Yuan Dynasty in China in 1275, they encountered an entirely different economic reality. Kublai Khan had established a centralized command economy stretching across the Eurasian steppe, operating on a scale that rendered European bullion logistics obsolete. Polo documented a technological leap in currency that most of Europe would not adopt for centuries, a unified, state-mandated system of paper money. This is the raw evidence, a bronze printing plate and the resulting paper currency. These intricate characters reveal imperial control. Only the state minted these plates, centralizing currency. The paper had no intrinsic worth. Merchants accepted it under threat of death. By replacing heavy bags of gold and silver with lightweight paper accepted from the Yellow Sea to the Middle East, the Mongols drastically lowered the logistical friction of transcontinental trade. Polo had uncovered the macroeconomic mechanism powering the empire. A standardized monetary system enabled the Pax Mongolica to function across thousands of miles without collapsing under its own physical weight. The Pax Mongolica was an actively engineered logistics network designed to maintain authority across thousands of miles of divided territory. The central nervous system of this empire was the Yam, an extensive imperial postal network. To control this vast landmass, the administration hardwired Eurasia with thousands of interlocking relay stations. Placed precisely 25 miles apart along main arteries, they ensured a reliable chain of fresh horses. With an imperial token, messengers moved military intelligence up to 250 miles a day. Polo integrated into this system, serving Kublai Khan as an active diplomat and tax collector, utilizing the Yam to travel and report back on regional economies. Every relay station, printed banknote, and commercial permit ultimately answer to the authority of Kublai Khan. Beyond communications, Polo also documented the raw energy systems required to sustain such massive urban centers. He recorded the mass industrial mining and burning of what he called black stones. The Mongols and Chinese were widely utilizing coal for heat and light, a practice largely absent from domestic settings in late medieval Europe. Through centralized postal networks and high-yield fuel sources, the Mongols had overcome the physical constraints of distance and energy production that were still severely bottlenecking European development. Yet the documentation of these systems did not occur in the field. The text was physically created in 1298, years after Polo had left the sophisticated infrastructure of China. While being held as a prisoner of war in Genoa, Polo dictated his memories to a fellow inmate, Rustichello de Pisa. Rustichello was a professional writer of chivalric romances. By passing Polo's raw intelligence through the filter of a commercial fiction writer, the objectivity of the text was immediately compromised. The contamination was also deliberate. Polo possessed a significant ego, and he fabricated details to inflate his own importance within the Mongol court, particularly regarding military engineering. Polo claims he provided the Khan with designs for European mangonels, catapults that broke the 3-year siege of the fortress at Shenyang. The dates render this claim impossible. The siege of Shenyang ended in 1273. The Polo family did not arrive at Kublai's court until 1275, 2 full years after the fortress had fallen. Both Chinese and Mongol records attribute the innovation of those specific siege engines to Arab technicians. Polo recognized a major historical event and simply wrote himself into the center of it. Beyond deliberate self-insertion, the text also suffers from Marco's failure to filter out the local folklore he encountered along the trade routes. While his anthropological notes on certain customs were highly accurate, he often reported regional myths with the same factual tone as his tax records. In Myanmar, he described unicorns, misclassifying the Asian rhinoceros. In Mongolia, he documented Prester John, a completely fictional Christian king, as genuine historical fact. The European audience receiving this text existed in an information vacuum. They possessed no framework to separate empirical data about coal burning and fiat currency from fables about mythical beasts and legendary kings. Paradoxically, this contamination ensured the survival of the intelligence. The familiar medieval tropes and romantic myths acted as a Trojan horse, allowing the highly advanced economic data to spread widely across medieval Europe. The paradox of the Travels is that a manuscript so compromised by self-aggrandizement and literary tropes successfully transmitted the most advanced economic intelligence of its era. Within decades, hundreds of manuscript copies circulated through the courts and merchant houses of 14th century Europe. When the Pax Mongolica eventually collapsed and land routes to Asia closed, Polo's text became a vital, static blueprint of Eastern wealth locked behind hostile borders. The empirical data within those pages, the documentation of immense, unified markets and vast resources, convinced European powers that accessing the East was an economic necessity. The focus shifted permanently from overland caravans to maritime exploration. This surviving ancient Portolan chart reflects that changing European ambition, mapping the physical coastlines needed to project maritime power outward. Despite all the fables and the fabrications, Marco Polo's hybrid intelligence report provided the exact psychological motivation and geographic framework that inspired navigators like Columbus to finally bridge the gap between Europe and the Far East. Marco Polo's writings provided 13th century Europe with its first empirical map of the East. These accounts provided the logistical data and toponyms that motivated later explorers, including Christopher Columbus, to attempt their own voyages across the globe. Despite that historical footprint, modern media presents 2 versions of his identity that rarely overlap, leaving the actual person buried under layers of conflicting narratives. Modern adaptations often lean into the cinematic. They depict Polo as a martial artist embroiled in deadly succession wars at the Mongol court. Simultaneously, a growing body of internet articles and skeptical historians argue that Polo was a complete fabrication, a merchant who never traveled beyond the Black Sea and simply compiled the stories of others. The historical Marco Polo lived the life of a pragmatic merchant and a mid-level tax bureaucrat, moving through a world shaped more by trade logistics than by con artistry or combat. To find that person, we have to look past the Hollywood choreography and the fraud listicles. We have to examine 13th century fiscal data and the messy variations found in the original manuscripts. Examining the verified economic records and the evolution of the text itself reveals a reality of medieval globalization that is far more complex than the myths suggest. Modern dramatic adaptations offer high-budget cross-cultural entertainment, often featuring meticulous costume design and world-building. However, these scripts frequently insert Polo into Mongol succession wars that do not align with the historical timeline. A common plot involves the conflict between Kublai Khan and his brother, Arik-Bokay. In reality, Arik-Bokay died in prison in 1266, 9 years before Marco Polo even reached China. These adaptations also popularize the character of Hundred Eyes, a blind monk who serves as a martial arts mentor for the young Venetian. The historical Bayan, or Hundred Eyes, was a fully cited general in the Mongol army. He was a high-ranking official who commanded massive cavalry divisions and fleets in battle, not a kung fu master living in the palace. Marco Polo occupied a subordinate position within the imperial administration. He worked as an emissary and a mid-level bureaucrat, far removed from the heroism depicted on screen. The Mongol rulers preferred to employ foreigners for these administrative tasks because they distrusted their local Han Chinese subjects. They used Europeans, Persians, and Central Asians to collect taxes and manage the state. While Hollywood creates compelling historical fiction, it significantly alters the timeline and the social hierarchy of the 13th century Mongol Empire to suit modern storytelling tropes. Skepticism toward Polo's journey gained traction with books like Did Marco Polo Go to China?, which argue that his account is a fraud. This theory relies on the logic of omission. It assumes that any real traveler would have recorded the most obvious cultural landmarks of the region. Skeptics frequently point to the absence of the habit of tea drinking, the practice of foot binding, the use of chopsticks, and the Great Wall. The Great Wall argument overlooks the fact that the massive stone structures we recognize today were largely 16th century Ming Dynasty projects. During the 13th century, the existing earthen barriers were in ruins and held little significance for the Mongols, who controlled territories on both sides. The other omissions are explained by the rigid cultural segregation within the empire. The Mongol ruling elite lived in a separate social sphere from the Han Chinese majority. Because Polo was embedded in the Mongol court, he consumed fermented milk rather than tea. Mongol women, who were active on horseback, did not practice foot binding, meaning Polo had little reason to observe Han Chinese households. These skeptical arguments often fail by applying 16th century cultural expectations to a 13th century Mongol-ruled landscape. While critics focus on what he missed, the economic data Polo actually documented provides a different perspective on his credibility. His detailed accounts of Yuan Dynasty fiscal policy and currency offer a level of administrative detail that is difficult to find in any other contemporary European source. This is a Yuan paper note. Polo documented the empire's state-guaranteed currency system, explaining how paper money centralized economic power. He described the manufacturing process, noting the paper was made from mulberry trees, and carried official stamped seals to verify value. Beyond currency, Polo provided an exhaustive look at the state monopoly on salt production, which served as a primary revenue driver for the Khan. He recorded hoisting brine and boiling it down into salt cakes, taxed for the treasury. This chart compares Polo's salt revenue totals with modern archaeological estimates. His figures align perfectly with imperial records, verified by modern historians. This level of bureaucratic precision suggests that Polo was working as a tax auditor or administrator, documenting the mundane economic realities of the empire from the inside. If the core data is accurate, the confusion surrounding the book often stems from the text itself. There is no authoritative original manuscript, only over 150 conflicting variations. The book was a collaboration between Polo and Rustichello de Pisa, a writer of Arthurian romances. They met and worked on the draft while imprisoned in Genoa between 1298 and 1299. This is the earliest known version, the F text. It was dictated in a mix of Old French and Northern Italian dialects, a hybrid language used by the mercantile and courtly elites of the time. Later translations, heavily revised by Victorian editors, smoothed the grammar and removed many of the text's idiosyncrasies to make it read like a modern travelogue. These modernized versions often erase the original literary tropes and the confusing shifts in narrative voice, where the text jumps between I, Marco, and third-person descriptions. Choosing a sanitized translation makes the book easier to read, but it hides the fascinating, messy process of transcription and transmission that actually created it. If you want to engage with Marco Polo's story today, your approach depends on your goals. For pure entertainment, the Netflix series is a strong choice, if viewed as historical fiction rather than biography. To understand the historical debate regarding his credibility, examine the research of Hans Ulrich Vogel, which analyzes the fiscal data that internet skeptics typically ignore. For those who want to read the book, look for English translations specifically based on the original Franco-Venetian F-text to experience the unvarnished medieval narrative. Marco Polo left a legacy of bureaucratic ledgers and mercantile observations. These records gave Europe an empirical map of Asia, providing the logistical details that shaped the next 2 centuries of global exploration. Persia. The Academy of Gundashapur functioned as the world's first international university, operating centuries before the rise of Baghdad. They gathered diagnostic texts from across the Mediterranean, importing the medical theories of Greece and Rome to be analyzed by Persian scholars. Simultaneously, they brought in knowledge from the East. This Indian palm leaf manuscript represents the complex pharmacological practices that Gundashapur absorbed from South Asia. Scholars at the Academy integrated these diverse texts, cross-referencing conflicting medical philosophies from different cultures to isolate the most effective treatments. By synthesizing the insights of 4 separate civilizations, Gundashapur established a unified global scientific tradition. The Academy's primary contribution was moving historical theory into the realm of applied, hands-on science. First, they institutionalized clinical training. Students were required to treat real patients under supervision rather than just studying scrolls in a library. Second, they developed the pharmacy system, the first organized, dedicated infrastructure for compounding and dispensing standardized medicines. Third, they pioneered medical research by systematically documenting specific diseases, their treatments, and surgical outcomes. Fourth, they established public health care. These hospitals were open to ordinary citizens, not just the social elite. Gundashapur turned medicine into a structured public institution, the same model we use today. By the 7th century, at the beginning of the Islamic era, Gundashapur served as a major repository for the ancient world's medical discoveries. When the Abbasid caliphs built Baghdad, they recruited Gundashapur scholars to staff the famous House of Wisdom, shifting the intellectual center of the world. These experts trained giants of Islamic medicine, like Al-Razi and Ibn Sina. This anatomical manuscript of the eye demonstrates how they carried Gundashapur's methods forward. The detailed labels for ocular muscles reveal a direct line of descent from the Academy's systematic documentation. Ironically, the Academy's success led to its decline. By exporting its scholars to larger cities like Baghdad, the physical institution was slowly abandoned. Gundashapur vanished as a location because its ideas became the new global standard. Today, the original physical site of the ancient academy is nothing but a collection of ruins, now largely forgotten by modern history. But without this specific synthesis of ancient knowledge, the Islamic Golden Age and the subsequent European medical awakening would have lacked their primary catalyst. The walls of Gundashapur are gone, but the systems it created are currently in use in every teaching hospital and pharmacy on the planet.